Destiny Herndon-De La Rosa is the founder of Wave Feminists, a feminist pro-life group that aims to reshape the divisive language surrounding the abortion debate. The group is trying to expand the anti-abortion movement so that it is more applicable to younger generations who view abortion less through a religious lens and more through a lens of human rights, science, and feminism. Inspired by her own experience as a young mother, she founded the group to provide women with enough support to make motherhood a consistently viable option. As a writer, she lives in Dallas, Texas. Her writing has appeared in the Dallas Morning News, and features on New Wave Feminists have been done by the New York Times, The Atlantic, Slate, Vice, and the Washington Post. Destiny has been interviewed and featured on programs such as PBS NewsHour and Fox and Friends. Welcome.
So, I'm going to take this out. Do you mind if we just kind of like pass it back and forth?
Oh, great.
Feminists do what they want, turns out. I put a blazer on so y'all would know I'm like a professional feminist right now, as opposed to my normal t-shirt. Okay, so Terrisa and I wanted to talk to you guys today just a little bit about feminism and our background and kind of what we're doing with our movement. And so I'm Destiny. You know what? Should I let you introduce Terrisa so you can, because she's pretty impressive herself. Okay, I'm gonna stall for a second while I pulls that up. As a pro-life feminist, I'm kind of a unicorn. People tell me I don't exist all the time. You are my people, because I'm sure y'all get that all the time as well, right? Like pro-life Democrat, that's not a thing. Whatever, it's a thing. We're like right here. We're all up in this renaissance right now. So I think having that, in my opinion, makes it even more punk rock, because it's kind of something where we're doing something different. We're challenging the status quo. And in any movement, you need to constantly be challenging that status quo and saying, are we being consistent? Are we focused on nonviolence and human rights? You know, okay, I stalled long enough.
So I'll introduce Terrisa now. Is a feminist, atheist, vegetarian, Democrat, and consistent life activist. Terrisa is founder and executive director of Prolife San Francisco, a millennial-focused grassroots activist group operating in arguably the most liberal city in America. She is the director of West Coast operations for Secular Pro-Life, serves on the board of directors of Rehumanize International, and speaks to pro-life groups on secular and millennium outreach throughout the United States. Her efforts have been featured in major media outlets such as Huffington Post, San Francisco Chronicle, NPR, Slate, Refinery 29, Daily Signal, Christian Post, Democratic Underground, and our Sunday Visitor. Welcome.
Thank you. Such a pleasure to be here. That's such a succinct introduction. So, yeah, I mean, I'm an on-the-ground activist. So I work, again, within the city of San Francisco on a daily basis. I talk to liberals about abortion and about consistent life ethic topics. So I'm really excited to share with you guys the importance of feminism, the role that feminism plays in millennial culture and in progressive culture today, and how we can utilize and better understand the way millennials understand feminism so that we can win, because we are Democrats for life. We're here to make the Democratic Party pro-life, and part of that means understanding where our pro-choice counterparts are coming from so that we can directly address this and ultimately be able to penetrate the culture to a degree that brings us the significant victory that we're hoping for. So I'm sure that a lot of you have heard about pro-life feminism before. Pro-life feminism is very, very diverse. There's a lot of different types of feminism out there, including different types of pro-life feminism. So I'm kind of hoping Destiny will talk us through the relationship between feminism and progressive values and feminism and pro-life values.
Yeah, so, you know, whenever people want to understand this concept of pro-life feminism, because again, most people used to walk up to me, and when I would say I was a pro-life feminist, they were like, that's an oxymoron, that doesn't make any sense. You know, feminism has become so synonymous with abortion access that this is a foreign concept. But really, it's my belief in the consistent life ethic that says I'm anti-war, I'm anti-death penalty, I'm anti-torture. I extend that into the womb when human beings are at their most vulnerable by also being anti-abortion. And to me, this is just consistent and very logical. And so when I start telling people that, they still don't agree with me usually, but they're like, all right, like I'll kind of listen to you. But then you take it a step further and you say, okay, well, that just makes me pro-life, but what actually makes me a feminist? Well, for most of history, women were treated as property. And so the fact that through our liberation and gaining rights, we are now oppressing the unborn person by treating them like property goes against one of the core values of feminism. We should be using our privilege, our strength, our liberation to protect the more vulnerable. And in a lot of radical feminist circles, you see them doing that. You see them caring about, immigrants and the marginalized and the impoverished, and we care about that too. But we just ask them, okay, why does the consistency stop there? Why don't you take it a step further? Why are we not focused on how abortion harms women? Why are we not focused on how abortion puts a target on impoverished women especially? So a little bit about my story. My mother was 19 years old when she got pregnant with me at the University of Texas. And, Austin, Texas is a very liberal college town. And so it would have made a ton of sense for her to have an abortion. It would have been viewed as the reasonable, responsible thing for her to do. But she knew I was a human being. She knew that I was alive. She knew that, the time for choosing had come and gone. I was on the scene now. And so she ended up moving back to Dallas with my grandparents, who are ordained ministers. And so that's a real hard conversation to have. Again, another reason where it would have been very easy for her to hide that I existed. And they're a pro-life family. And so they said, okay, we're going to support you. This is going to be hard, but we're here for you. That's a vital component when it comes to a woman choosing whether or not abortion is an option for her, whether she has that support system that's actually going to allow her to truly have a choice. Because that's the irony of pro-choice. Oftentimes it's no choice. It's somebody feeling like they have no other option. They're going to be kicked out of their home, or, they don't have health care. And I can tell you that, years later, I ended up facing my own unplanned pregnancy at 16. When you're 16, you have no idea how much it costs to have a baby. Like, it could cost $1,000 or $100,000. Like, you don't know. And it's roughly about $10,000, by the way. Luckily, I had health insurance, and so that covered it. But I had other friends at school who didn't. And I mean, when they told their parents they were pregnant, it was basically, okay, get in the car. We're going to get an abortion. And so once I saw women, when I was dealing with my own teen pregnancy, I actually went back to school after summer break, and I was, 5 months pregnant, had the little belly, and was walking down the hall, and this girl stopped me, and she said, hey, I was pregnant over the summer too. And I looked down, and she didn't have the little belly. And so I said, we're pregnant. You mean you killed your baby? And I was really proud of saying that. Like, I felt like that's the pro-life answer to have, right? And she was like, F you, and stormed off, rightfully so. Like, I completely understand that now as a decent human, that I said the wrong thing. But at the time, I went home and I told my mom, and she's pro-life and I'm pro-life, and she's going to be really proud of me for calling this woman out. And when I told her, she said, okay, so she'll have her next abortion in your honor. You get that right. You're not a safe person. She's never going to come talk to you again. And I don't know what happened in that moment. It was just this gut punch. And my mom said, you know better than anybody how scary this is. And it was scary. I had a family that was supporting me, but my boyfriend took off. I was never gonna get pregnant, and here I was, 16, and my whole life was changing. Like, I knew that in that moment, the fear and the panic that is set in, nobody could have said anything negative to me that I wasn't already saying to myself. There was just so much self-loathing that I found myself in this position. So if you would have called me a whore or whatever, like from a street corner, I would have been like, yeah. The only thing that drove that out was my family saying, we still love you, and it's okay, and we're here for you. It added this calm to the storm that was going on internally for me. So the next day I go back to school, and another girl comes up, and this girl was like a bad bee. I don't know if y'all know what that is, but she was like, school principals scared of her, teachers are scared of her, like, very intimidating person. And she walks up, and I'm sitting at this long lunch table, and I was reading What to Expect When You're Expecting, because that's what you do when you're a teen mom. And she said, hey, I was pregnant this summer too. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, I have had less than 24 hours to come up with a new plan for how I'm supposed to handle this. And so I kind of didn't know what to say, but I realized even that was coming off as a form of judgment. So I said, how far along were you? And she goes, I don't know, like 12 weeks. And at this point, I'm getting these babysitter email updates telling me that my baby's the size of a kumquat and all the crap going on with them. And I think it's amazing because, again, wanted pregnancy. Now you care about fingernails and toenails and eyelashes and all this fetal development. And so I said something like that to her, like, oh, fingernails and toenails. And she slammed her hand on the table, and very similar reaction to the girl the day before. If I wanted to effing know that, and she cusses me out and she storms off. At that point, I had this realization that I clearly needed to be a pro-life activist. I needed to dedicate my life to this work because I'm amazing at it. The realization was that basically one girl, I gave her judgment and condemnation. The other girl, I gave her basic biological information, facts that she should have had before she ever walked through the doors of an abortion clinic. I suddenly turned this clump of cells into a real child, and the amount of regret that she suddenly, it was a horrible thing to see in someone's eyes. And I just thought, I never want to see that again. So when I founded New Wave Feminist, the idea is that we're pro-life, we're pro-woman, and we're pro-education. You can't cherry pick the type of information women are getting, kids are getting today, especially with the internet. I have 4 kids, and the internet's the worst thing that ever happened. You can't shelter anymore, right? And so what you see is groups like Planned Parenthood go into schools and they talk about pregnancy, but it's cherry picked. They talk about the fun stuff. They don't really talk about the consequences and the stuff that might come from it. I'm planning on going through a sex ed training next year, and when I mentioned this to the woman who trains the Planned Parenthood people to go into schools, she said, Destiny, don't worry, they don't even talk about abortion. That's a problem. The fact that they make money off of abortion, but they don't talk about it, not when the fun part's still going on, that's a real problem. And I think that is where feminists especially can come in and say, we're focused on the whole woman. We're focused on, sex positivity and your health and prevention and all of these different angles that are going to make it so that you can have a successful life and that you can have a child when you choose to. But unfortunately, I think a lot of times, obviously the pro-life movement, the narrative is, it's all this monolith. It's, old conservative people who just want to control women's, but I don't care what you do with your body. I do not care what you do with your body. Pierce it, tattoo it, do any of the things. You don't end the life of another human being. It's their body we're talking about. So with feminists, when we talk about bodily autonomy, I think it's imperative that we focus on the bodily autonomy of the unborn child. We've been talking about that for a few years, and the really cool thing is there was a horrible article in The Nation recently, a father who had a child with Down syndrome, and he was basically making an argument, the most ridiculous ableist argument in the world of why you should be able to terminate a child just like his son. But at one point in the article, he says we have to prioritize bodily autonomy. That is a huge win for us, that they were even willing to acknowledge that there is bodily autonomy for the unborn person. So anyway, those are just some of the ways that we're making waves in the pro-life movement. But again, I'm down in Texas, so it's a little easier for me than Terrisa in San Francisco, where it's insane. It's insane, so.
I'm so excited to tell you about the insanity that I experience every day in the most pro-choice place in our nation. San Francisco is actually a really diverse place, and I spent the last 5 or 6 years as a director for secular pro-life, so I've been active on the national level or like on an online capacity, but I decided a couple years ago that the key to this puzzle is to dig in on a cultural level in places that are really important in this debate. And San Francisco is absolutely crucial for several reasons. It is the unofficial hub of millennial culture in the United States because of the tech industry. It's a city full of millennials from across the world. And there's a lot of media there, and because there's such a strong pro-choice presence there as well. NARAL and Planned Parenthood consider it their safe place. So it's a juxtaposition of a lot of different things that make it a really, really crucial place for the pro-life movement, and specifically for pro-life Democrats, because it is one of the most blue cities in our country as well. So when it comes to community organizing, I have done a lot of things that have worked, and I've done a lot of things that have not. But one thing that I have learned is that the language of millennials and the language that will help us to bring other Democrats to the pro-life side is one of feminism. It is the position which informs most young progressives' position on social issues. These ideas of equality, nonviolence, and non-discrimination, which we know fit perfectly well into a pro-life position. In fact, that's what informs our pro-life position. So naturally, there's a relationship there. And when I talk to pro-choice people in San Francisco, the vast majority of them still consider this a very tough issue. Even in the city, even to people who would never, ever consider a conservative point of view on literally anything else, they almost always admit that this is a difficult issue. There's so much hope for the Democratic Party on this issue. We have held so strong, even in the face of having basically zero leadership on this issue, like from a political standpoint, but yet we are still here in numbers. And we see it in the numbers for millennials too, that even though they're leaning so much more left on a host of issues, we're not seeing that same significant trend in terms of abortion. In fact, some studies have shown that the millennial generation is even a little bit more pro-life and less likely to support abortion on demand than baby boomers. So that's a huge opportunity. So I'm here to inject a little bit of hope in regards to that. But also in my activism, I have learned that there are some things that are huge turnoffs for feminists in particular. And most young millennials that are coming from a leftist point of view are identifying this way. And now these things are very controversial, and I realize like a lot of people will disagree with some of these barriers. But I think that it's important to talk them out because we've got to find solutions. And I am, an atheist, I'm a feminist, I'm a Democrat, and I found my way to the pro-life movement. So I think that we have to find a way to get more people like that so that we can convince everyone that this isn't just a religious issue, this isn't a generational issue, this is an issue for all mankind, and it's something that absolutely every progressive should care about. So with that being said, I'm going to gently go into some of these things. The first is the concept of sexual integrity. Now, that's a very popular concept within the pro-life movement, and I think that there's absolutely a place for that. It's really important for people in communities that believe in sexual integrity and believe in the idea of natural law. This is very compelling for a lot of people. But for a very left-leaning, progressive, secular, feminist person, natural law is not a thing that they subscribe to. And the minute we start talking about sexual integrity, it signals something to them. It says, I'm coming from a conservative religious point of view. Whether you've mentioned that at all or not, I mean, you are obviously a Democrat, but it doesn't matter at that point. You've mentioned something about sex intended for marriage or something like that. I'm not saying that that doesn't have a place, and I understand a lot of people have a lot of passions in regard to that. I'm not saying to hinder that. I'm just giving you the information should you be in a situation with someone who maybe is much more secular or left-leaning, that maybe that's not something you want to lead with. And then the second thing is also kind of tied to that, but it's birth control. And I realize that there are a lot of people in the pro-life movement, and there's a lot of compelling studies that imply that birth control can cause an early abortion. And I mean, to be clear, obviously we're pro-lifers, so if it does in fact do that, then we're against it. But the science, although very, very strong in some studies, is very, very weak in others. And from a secular standpoint, with secular pro-life has maintained a pro-hormonal birth control stance because we haven't found enough compelling studies on a secular level for us to say that it's wrong. But in terms of community organizing, that doesn't make sense at all, right? Because we all have different views about birth control within the pro-life movement. So some of us don't believe birth control causes abortion, some do. But the bottom line is that we need absolutely everyone. So when we're talking about birth control being an abortifacient, we're signaling something again, and we could be isolating other people that are like totally see abortion as a violent act, but think it's kind of inconsistent that we wouldn't also be trying to outlaw women drinking caffeine in their early pregnancy because it could cause a miscarriage. So it just seems like an inconsistency to a lot of secularists. So it's definitely something that can help if it's not something that we're leading with. And then the final thing is the bodily integrity thing that Destiny brought up. And I think a lot of times we do get into that idea where it's like, okay, yes, bodily autonomy is important, right? That's important in our culture. But we automatically jump to, well, you know, the baby also has its own bodily autonomy. But I think that this also signals something to a lot of feminists. It's the understanding of bodily autonomy doesn't necessarily rely on the right to life over the right to bodily autonomy. For example, there was a case in the 1970s, Shimp versus McFall. Shimp needed a bone marrow transplant. He sued his cousin for his bone marrow, and the court sided with McFall, saying that he, although like Shimp has a right to life, he's definitely a born person, and we care about him, but we don't have the right to force this other person to sustain his body against his will. So it's a complicated argument, is my point. And that if we go into it automatically dismissing it as a non-issue, that's a red flag for most feminists, that you're not considering the issue to the degree that they are. Now, obviously, as a pro-lifer, I don't think the vast majority of abortions can be justified by bodily autonomy, but I think it's really valuable in our conversations with feminists to acknowledge that it is a challenging situation and that it's not just as easy as saying, well, you know, the baby has bodily autonomy too. It's much more complicated than that. One thing that I think we can really focus on that is really helpful for me on the ground is focusing on corruption and Planned Parenthood as this anti-feminist organization. That resonates with a lot of hardcore progressives in San Francisco. They're like, once you tell them how much money Planned Parenthood is making off of vulnerable communities and how they're doing that by destroying human lives, that's something that really piques the interest of a lot of feminists. It resonates with that whole anti-capitalist point of view that is very, very prevalent in the far left. So I would encourage you to really kind of magnify that. And ultimately, I think the only way that we're really going to get to the vast majority of our left-leaning people is to ultimately defund Planned Parenthood so that we can stop them from dominating the conversation on this. So that's basically my advice. Take it with a grain of salt. If it's valuable to you, please use it. If it's not, that's okay too. I mean, it's up to you guys to determine what's best for your own communities, and that's it. So thank you.
I'm going to add more to that. I have found that I travel a lot and speak at colleges, and I talk to a lot of pro-life groups, but also there's a lot of feminists who come there just to like mean mug me, and then I keep waiting to be like heckled, and it hasn't happened yet because they're like, okay, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, whatever, and then they just walk out. But a big thing is I actually don't talk about Planned Parenthood. I talk about the abortion industry, and in particular, I use the language that's their language, that's my language. I talk about violence. I talk about the marginalized. You know, I make sure to bring that up. I talk about ableism, the fact that abortion targets those with disabilities. And but if I bring up Planned Parenthood, I was telling someone earlier, Planned Parenthood is actually amazing when it comes to marketing. So they have marketed themselves as healthcare for poor women. And when you say you're against Planned Parenthood, you basically are saying, well, I'm against healthcare for poor women to far too many people. That's what they hear. So I always say, if you walk up to the average Joe and, you know, ask them to play a word association game, with Planned Parenthood, it's healthcare for poor women. With pro-lifers, if you say, I say pro-life, you say, what are they going to say? It's bullhorns, giant signs, shooting doctors, like it's all of this crazy violent stuff. We have a major marketing problem on our side, and Planned Parenthood totally has us beat when it comes to that. So a lot of times when I talk to actual individual women about their experiences at Planned Parenthood, they were moved through there like cattle. They didn't get the personal attention. It's subpar care for women. So what I like to talk about is that, you know, I'm an uninsured woman in Texas. Like, I need healthcare. Don't tell me you're going to take away healthcare. Tell me what options you're going to bring to the table. And I think that's a big thing where we as pro-lifers can come out and say, we want to make sure that you're getting quality healthcare and that you have options. Because when there's a monopoly on any business, they suddenly don't have to compete. They can offer subpar care because who's going to hold them accountable? You're not going to go anywhere else. They have you totally locked into that. So a big thing whenever talking about Planned Parenthood, because again, their marketing's so amazing, people feel like this is their personal business, their brand in some way. And when you start talking about it, they get very defensive. I think it's always better to ask questions. Do you think women should have options when it comes to healthcare, especially, poor women who are uninsured or underinsured? Do you think they should have options? Because, especially as Democrats, I think that's incredibly important. We don't say, okay, just because, you're financially struggling right now, you just get whatever. That's not a solution. Women should still be able to make sure that they're getting quality health care. And I think that that's a big thing where the pro-life movement has kind of, we focus a lot on this one business in particular, but I've found just through trial and error, when I replace talking about Planned Parenthood and just say, big abortion, just like big business, because that's what it is. It's an industry that makes money off of it. You get all those like Occupy Wall Street people going, hold on, what do you mean by that? I know of big pharma. What's big abortion? Explain that one to me. And then they're much more inclined to listen to what you're actually saying. And with that, are we going to do Q&A?
It's been very enlightening. Very informative. Any questions? You would stay for a few moments. We'll have for questions. Maybe you have 30 minutes. Their time runs out, so you got 30 more minutes to ask questions. I'll give the mic to you ladies. You determine which you want to ask.
We'll wrestle for it, depending on.
Discuss the feminization of poverty. Also consequences for men.
Yeah, that's the thing. Once we made human life optional, it created this hostility against our fertility in the workplace and in the culture where suddenly, if you're working at a company and you go in and let them know that you're expecting, they're upset with you. Like, why did you do, you're choosing to have this baby. Why are you doing this, right? And so we have, we've certainly made it one there, but then also when it comes to single motherhood and men saying, all right, you had a choice, now I get a choice too. And so one of the things when I speak at colleges, I talk about the 3 predominantly male groups that benefit from abortion. And as a feminist, I have to say the word patriarchy like 3 times or they pull my card. But when I'm talking about the patriarchy, I'm talking about like bad dudes, not good dudes. I'm married to a dude. I made 2 dudes with my body. Like, I'm a big fan of men in general, so I'm probably not talking about anybody in here. But as far as patriarchy, we see a federal government that can benefit from killing the poor in the womb. It's just easier than 18 years of government aid. We see predators who they love abortion because then they can cover up any of the evidence of a crime. And so when you hear someone say, well, what about in cases of rape? I always say, let's talk about that. Let's talk about cases of rape because you're completely ignoring the amount of people who use this to keep women silent and to keep their crimes hidden. And then the third group is douchebags, is what I say. And sometimes when I speak to a church, I say D-bags. But y'all are mature enough. I can say douchebags. I'm not worried. But it's the guys who absolutely want to use the radical feminist wave to benefit themselves sexually. And I always say, if you pictured like the biggest, greasiest guy from Jersey Shore, like that dude, and he walked out into the world, what would his douchebag utopia look like? It would look a lot like what we have going on right now in third wave feminism. Like, no, let's go Dutch on this. I'll pay for my meal. Don't do anything for me. I'm going to offer up, commitment-free sex, no strings attached. Like, this whole world actually caters to males quite a bit, and abortion allows that to happen. I'm not anti-birth control, but I do think that we need to be questioning what it does to females' bodies. When you're on it for 15, 20 years and you've got this hormone in your system, this class 1 carcinogen, and yet men aren't expected to carry the brunt of any of that. So again, like you said, it feminizes poverty. It takes on, the patriarchy used to be men had all the power and money. I would argue that now it's that they have health as well. And our health is expected to suffer, whether it's from, chemical contraceptives or even abortion. And so I challenge that view a lot of times saying like, look at where we have come. The fact that Cosmo magazine is considered a feminist publication is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. It's a sex ed manual on how to please your man, and yet that's what we consider feminism right now, because that's where women take their power. And the reason that that's an issue, I don't think is religious or conservative or anything. It's because we completely ignore human dignity, and human dignity is at the core of everything we're doing. I'm very sex positive. I want people to be having great sex. I don't think it happens when we degrade ourselves. I don't think it happens from the hookup culture that we've created, because women's bodies will always bear the brunt of responsibility when it comes to pregnancy at the end of the day. And so when we completely ignore that part of it, I think we kind of do ourselves a disservice. Did you want to add another question? Yes.
Elaborate on how birth control is a barrier to some church-going people from being involved in this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it just ultimately, from the very beginning, the pro-choice movement was established with this idea that the pro-life position is a purely religious one. Bernard Nathanson, who was an abortion provider in New York, co-founded NARAL, became pro-life later as an atheist. He eventually became Catholic, so you guys got him anyways. But he wrote extensively about how the pro-choice movement was set up from the beginning to be, or the pro-life movement was set up to be seen as a religious cause, that they took great effort to actually suppress the opinions of Protestants, of non-religious people, of non-traditionally religious people, in order to frame it this way, because it's so powerful. And here we are 40 years later, and the rhetoric is so similar. And the reality is that yes, there is a correlation between religiosity and being pro-life, but that doesn't mean that the vast majority of pro-choicers are still identifying as religious in some way. And I think that the concern with these mostly Christian pro-choice people is that they feel like, well, okay, maybe I think that it's wrong in terms of my faith, but I don't want to impose my religion on other people. And this is so powerful. And the pro-choice side knows that. They know that this kind of rhetoric is preventing pro-choice Christians from being actually politically pro-life. And it's so important to magnify the voices of people who don't fit into that traditional stereotype. So there's definitely a debate to be had about whether birth control is harmful or helpful to women, or whether or not it's ultimately causes or reduces abortions, or there's all these debates to be had. But at the end of the day, we don't have time for those kind of games. We need victory. And victory can only be achieved if we do what we have been preaching, which is to open up the big tent and to say, okay, there's a debate on birth control. We don't agree on that debate, but you're still against the violence of elective abortion, and we need to come together. I'm willing to join hands with people in San Francisco who maybe are pro-choice but are anti-Planned Parenthood, because they're out there. Or people that are against abortion after the first trimester. That's huge. That is a pro-life position that we need to harness and we need to accentuate. And then ultimately, it's an incremental victory. But we can't take such a hard-line stance where we continue to fall into this place where we're fulfilling the dreams of the pro-choice movement by being sounding religious every time we talk, anti-birth control, sexual integrity, and that kind of thing. So that's why I think it's just really, really crucial to bringing them in. So thank you for letting me ramble about that. In the back, white shirt.
How do you address the sense of nihilism in the millennial culture?
So I think it comes down to moral relativism, and you just have to find their spot where it does matter, because they wouldn't be fine with us stealing cars or killing people or whatever the other issues are. And again, I think that's where really just challenging inconsistency. I was talking to Janet earlier about veganism. And so if you know someone who's a vegan and they're very pro-choice, and, but not that, they're very pro-choice. And so you have somebody who, I'm just a Pollyanna optimist. I look at that and see something in them that recognizes pain in other beings, whether it's animals or humans, right? And so I think that's a great opportunity for us to applaud that and say, I love that you care about this. You know, we see it a lot with like anti-war marches and stuff. I love that you care about these people on the ground. You don't want these things to happen. And in war-torn countries, we have sex trafficking and all these other issues we can agree on. And when we find all this common ground and we spend time, you know, being relational and getting to know people and not just bumper sticker talking points with them, then we take it a little bit further and say, okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So explain to me why you're okay with abortion, because you're protecting like, you know, unborn bald eagle eggs and stuff, but like, why is abortion okay again? And I think you really have to be disarming. You have to come at it from that type of perspective of asking them. And, you know, I was saying, even if the person at the end of it, this is what they do 9 times out of 10. They give you all these like mental gymnastics and all this moral relativism for why it's okay and this thing and bodily autonomy and and all the things that they've heard. And I say, okay. And then I walk off. That's the most powerful thing I can do. Not go back and be like, hold on, and start getting into pro-life apologetics, but just say, all right, I don't know. And then leave them alone with those thoughts to really reflect on their own inconsistencies, because everybody here existing on the earth has some level, there's something that's wrong. You know, there's something, they wouldn't say rape's okay. They wouldn't say, you know, murder's okay, but they make this exception. And I a lot of times find with most people who aren't hardcore nihilists, at least, it's a default position. It's something they haven't even really thought through very far. And so if we can help them, okay, you've made it from, you know, point A to point C, but let's go through all the way to point Z. Let's talk about, you know, the ways that this infects an entire community and the ways that this impacts women. You know, again, it's something where if you care about the good of humanity and women succeeding, then we need to hear stories from women who were coerced into abortions, who were forced into it because they didn't have other resources. I do think most people that I meet feel some moral obligation, and they might disagree on whether the government should be providing these services or, you know, charities should be providing them. But at the end of the day, 90% of the people I talk to follow the golden rule. You know, that's what they live by. And yet we live in this nation now where we've been so divided and told that we're on polar opposite sides and they're extreme pro-lifers and extreme pro-choicers. I don't think so. I really don't think so. I think once, you know, like Terrisa said, you start talking to them about restrictions and, you know, pain capable type bills, things like that. Every time you have that conversation, you humanize the unborn child, because that's at the core of what's happened. They have dehumanized the unborn child. And when we look back on history, anytime we have taken a huge swath of people and dehumanized them, we have been able to murder them without remorse. And we look back and we're horrified that we have been able to do this. But then when it comes to the unborn, you know, we make all the same exceptions that were used in Nazi Germany and were used for slavery. And it's horrifying the way that we have found this new group to dehumanize. I think I answered your question kind of somewhere in there. I also answered 8 other questions that were not asked, so you're welcome.
How do you have the conversation with millennials about when life begins?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, because I think at the end of the day, all things considered, bodily autonomy and all of these other issues that we've brought up, it really does come down to personhood. It comes down to the fact that in our culture, most people don't necessarily see a preborn child as a person or a valuable member of our society. I think that it's important to listen to people, because you'll want to hear exactly when they think life begins. I mean, ultimately, every point that someone tries to draw in terms of personhood, it ends up excluding some people in the born population. There's no consistent objective distinction between person and human being, or yeah, exactly. So like, we know that a fetus or a zygote or an embryo is a human being, biologically speaking, but the question is, you know, when do we value that life? So I think that just asking questions, finding out exactly where they're pinpointing it, and then trying to draw that to someone in the born population. For example, if someone is saying, well, you know, it's about like having those real human qualities, that where you can discern your environment and really kind of understand what's going on, that's so unique to human beings, that gives us the right to life. But of course that doesn't occur until 15 months after birth. So, then at that point, would they be advocating for infanticide? Probably not. Maybe they're saying that only human beings past this certain level of brainwave capacity has a right to life. Well, they're only consistent in that if they're like an ethical vegan, then, because they're not honoring that right for animals who've achieved that kind of cognitive ability. So there's always going to be this distinction that they're drawing that isn't quite consistent in some other aspect of their philosophy. So that's usually where I like to start with that. What about you?
Yeah, I just ask them if they even science, usually, because science, I don't know. I don't know that I go much further than that. I mean, we talk about conception, and that is, it is biologically when life begins. The only time I ever really get into splitting hairs is when I talk about birth control with people, and I do think we need to have a pro-life conversation about birth control, because I think there's a lot of confusion. I was at a march recently, and there was this woman who, old school pro-lifer, and she was talking about how she goes into pharmacies and she takes the Plan B and she throws it on the floor, and then she's like, pro-life for life, and like walks out or something. And I was like, I don't feel like that's an effective way to do things. Plan B is 3 birth control pills. That's what Plan B is. Ask a pharmacist. That's what it is. And the way that it works is by thickening the mucus so that, sperm will not travel upright. And then when we talk about birth control, the way it works, it stops ovulation. That's the first line of defense. The second line of defense is going to be if there is breakthrough ovulation, it makes it harder for the fertilized egg, which I know is a word that we as a pro-life movement don't use. A conceived, conception has already taken place. This fertilized egg, it can't implant because it makes the uterine lining inhospitable. And that's where Terrisa and I were talking, okay, well, if I go out binge drinking or, eat a cheeseburger, like that can have the same hormonal effects. So where do we draw the line on how fertile we expect women to be? So if a woman is on birth control and it's stopping most ovulation, breakthrough ovulation does happen, there's a chance that her birth control can work as an abortifacient. At the same time, if that same woman is not on any type of birth control, she's sexually active, now ovulation's taking place regularly, and the chances of her getting pregnant and having her own just body makeup, the body chemistry, having an inhospitable womb could cause miscarriage the same type of way. And so, like we said, the science on whether or not most birth control is not quite clear yet. That's the one point where I do have the argument with people on, conception, because if you're talking conception, then it really does, you have to take a very scientific look at hormonal birth controls, and even different ones. Long-acting birth controls are going to act differently, IUDs and such. And so I think there's some really kind of great dialogue we need to be having in the pro-life movement about the different forms of birth control, just to educate ourselves so that we understand it better, and so that we don't look like idiots when we're interviewed by people and we compare RU486 with Plan B, two totally separate things. And of course, so by that point, a lot of times people will say heartbeat. And I've found that that's a good one. Your heartbeat, is where we determine life. Okay, so if heart beats it, then that happens like 16 days after implantation. It's certainly, these things are all happening, these markers all happen long before a woman probably even realizes she's pregnant, let alone tries to acquire an abortion. And every stage beyond that, when they're talking about sentience, when they're talking about ability to live outside of the womb, all of those things are vulnerabilities. All of them make them a vulnerable human being. The reason most of y'all are in this room is because you care about the vulnerable. So those things, in my mind, I was going to say aren't weaknesses, but they quite literally are weaknesses. Those are all reasons for us to stand up for the unborn person even more, because they haven't reached a stage of sentience yet, because they haven't reached a stage of viability yet. Yes.
What are your thoughts on the Catholic encyclical Humanae Vitae?
Yeah, I would be interested. I mean, I'm not Catholic, but I would actually be interested in checking that out because, again, the more information we know of our audience, the people we're talking to, you see people going into that abortion clinic with rosaries around their mirror as they drive in. So if we know how to speak to a Catholic woman in her language about what it is that's going to impact her and help her see the humanity of the unborn, if we know how to talk to the atheist about the scientific development, fetal development of an unborn child, all of these things I think are really powerful. And you, at the end of the day, just can't have too much information. So definitely, I would encourage everybody to check that out because someone told me it's the anniversary, so there's a lot of articles about it being written right now.
Where are the articles being written?
Human Vitae, or someone, Humane Vitae? I'm totally mispronouncing. Humane Vitae. Okay, so someone actually they called me the other day to ask me as a secularist if I could give them, they were sending me the information because they want to quote for me. They want to see if it transfers to the secular world. So I think it's because of the anniversary or something is what's spurring people to have an interest. Once I find out where it is, I'll let you know. Yes.
Are millennials learning about the connection between eugenics and abortion?
Yeah, I can answer that real quick. I think we're out of time, but I can answer it real quick. No, they're absolutely not doing it. I had a woman from Oregon who's working on her thesis right now who interviewed me last weekend, and it was about pro-life and pro-choice feminism. And she said, the more that I look into the history of this, I'm no longer pro-choice. So, I mean, no, absolutely. Once they have the history, they start to see that, yes, this is absolutely a continuation. We're going to be around, so you guys can ask us questions to our faces later if you want.
Thank you so much. It's been very informative, and thanks for being here.